So this is an outline of what I plan to cover today. So we'll go over a little bit of background as far as what research data management is and why it's important. We'll talk about research data, the research data lifecycle, and the data management activities within that lifecycle. I'll go over some funder and journal requirements as they relate to data management, and I'll discuss some considerations around data. We will then look at how we document data using a data management plan, and we'll conclude with some resources to hopefully help you out. I do recognize that this is a lot of information to cover. So as we mentioned, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat. I'll try and pause periodically to let information sink in as well. Okay, so to start with, let's look at what we mean when we say research data management and why it's important for our work. So I'd like to start with some broad definitions of research data management, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. So research data management is a term that is used to describe the processes that researchers and institutions use for organizing, securing, archiving, and sharing research data throughout the research lifecycle. And it's important to note that data management practices, they cover the entire lifecycle of the data. There are many examples of why we should manage our research data. I've listed a couple here. You could probably think of other reasons. So you may start onboarding or helping in a new lab and you're handed some notes from a previous colleague. Will you be able to follow and reproduce that expected workflow in its entirety? Or have you ever had to go and look for a file, but you don't remember what you named it or where you put it? Have you ever gone into a folder and you have multiple files that have similar names? Do you know which one is final or the authoritative one or just the version you should be working with next? Have you ever received a spreadsheet or other information, but you're not clear about maybe what the header abbreviations mean or there's missing data? And if you've ever lost data due to corruption, drive failure, or lack of backups, this is, that's kind of extreme, but it does happen. So these issues, they don't only cause frustration, but lost time and data, and even duplication of efforts and data. So with the previous examples in mind, I like this list that's provided by the Princeton Research Data Services as to why it's important to manage our data. So we can see a lot of benefits. We can find our data, we can ensure project continuity, we can save time, we can reduce the risk of lost data, and I would also add redundant and reworked data. It allows for easier validation of results. Your data can be shared, which may lead to collaboration and greater impact. And it also allows you to comply with some of these funder and journal requirements that we'll talk about a little bit later. So I'd like to go back to our definitions of research data management and unpack them just a little. We're going to review some specific terms in there. So research data, research lifecycle, and then data management practices. And we'll start with research data. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Okay. So we're going to talk about what it is and also what it isn't. Oops. So let me go back one. Went too far. Okay, so ODU does maintain a research and scholarly digital data management policy. And according to this policy, research data is digitally recorded information necessary to support or validate a research project's observations, findings, or outputs. And I also like this other definition from Data Sharing in Humanities, the input or output of your research, without which you couldn't have drawn your conclusions. Depending on your discipline, what is considered data will be different. So it all depends on the context of your research. Any of these might be considered data, including spreadsheets, surveys, audio, video, models and simulation, and even archival material and historic documents. Research data might be primary, so it's collected or generated by you as the researcher. You could use data that's already been collected previously or generated by someone else. You could have quantitative or qualitative data, or your methodology could include both of those. Data can be observational, experimental, simulated, and or compiled. I will point out one small thing. You may have noticed that the ODU policy specifies digitally recorded material, as does generally the US Office of Management and Budget. But I would keep in mind that some things may be required to be digitized, maybe even if they weren't originally in your research project. And regardless of whether your research products are digital or not, it is best practice to have processes and procedures for managing those products. And it's also important to note here that not everything related to your research project would be considered data under certain definitions. And these may vary between project to project or funder to funder. So the National Institutes of Health state that lab notebooks and preliminary analyses, completed case forms, drafts and plans and physical objects are not considered data under their definition. Okay, the next two terms, and I'm going to review them together, are the research data lifecycle and then data management activities that fall within that. So you're probably familiar with some form of the research lifecycle, and it's a term that's very frequently used when we're describing research, and it's a good model for the steps involved. So from planning to data collection to processing and analyzing to storing, sharing, and reusing. But it is a representation of the process. It's not always so straightforward and tidy, and you'll probably be bouncing between these steps quite a bit throughout the process. Specific activities, at least in my mind, the activities, practices, and procedures that fall within the realm of data management can generally be grouped into one of these four themes of data organization, data documentation, data storage, and data sharing and preservation. And I'm going to go through each of these briefly, and I'll keep the little life cycle wheel on the left, just for reference. I really like this quote from the Ohio State University as best practices begin with knowing what data you have and where it is. So establishing a file structure and a file naming convention before you start collecting your data and ensuring that this is documented. This is going to save you time when storing and locating data during your project. You'll want to think about how your data is best organized. It could be by date, by experiment, or some other method. We should keep our raw and our processed data separate. And if necessary, ensure you have a method for versioning your data. And then when you publish your data, you might want to think about the format. So is it proprietary? Could we provide our file formats in another way that could be more accessible to a broader audience? Data documentation, so often called metadata. This is important throughout the entire life cycle. So it describes the who, what, where, when, and why of your data and your research project. So this will help you, as well as others, understand what you did, how you did it, and why you did it. It can include information about the methodology, things about abbreviations and the file naming conventions that we just talked about. And if anything changes, you'll want to document that change, when it occurred, and why it occurred. Data storage should be thought of at the beginning of the project as to what options for storage will best fit your data. So are there privacy and confidentiality concerns or sensitive data that are going to need a higher level of access control? And during the data collection analysis phase, this is kind of what I think of like active storage. So you're actively working with your files and you're going to need to think about versioning and backups and also roles and responsibilities around those tasks. Data sharing and preservation, it generally, not always, but it generally occurs at the end of the project once your data are in a final, or at least a version that is a final state. And things to think about are where's the best place to deposit your data? Are there restrictions, again, as to who should have access based on privacy or confidentiality? Is the accompanying documentation complete and accurate and up to date? And should a license be applied so that users understand how the data should be used in the future? So the best time to think through all these activities, decide on your plan and your best practices is at the planning and design phase of your research before the project even starts. And one way we can document our data management activities is with a data management plan. So many of the same principles that we talked about as to why research data should be managed can also apply to why we should document our processes and procedures around data management. And that includes project organization, project continuity, and reducing the risk of misplaced, redundant, and or reworked data. And we'll get into requirements in a little bit, but even if it's not required, a data management is a good idea because it can save you time. It provides a record of what you intended to do. It clarifies who should or shouldn't have access to the data and any weaknesses that might need to be addressed up front. So before we get into the details of a data management plan, I'm going to look at some background and requirements around data management and sharing. But does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So at this point, many federal agencies such as NIH, NSF, IMLS, they require some form of a data management plan to be included with proposals for funding. And the US government is and has been expecting increased data sharing, transparency, and public access to research data under the thought that taxpayers are paying for this data and they should have timely access to the research outputs that they are funding. There have been 2 Office of Science and Technology policy memos that support increased public access to research outputs from federally funded research. The most recent is the 2022 Nelson memo. And this one, it builds upon the previous memorandum, but it specifies the removal of an embargo period for papers, meaning that when an article is published, it should also be made publicly available immediately. There used to be a year period in there where you could publish an article and then make it publicly available. They've currently removed that. And then the data underlying the research papers must also be made available at the time that research paper is published. The revised agency policies are required to go into effect by this December. So some do have their policies already in effect. Others have published policies that will go into effect, and some still have not yet published their updated policies. Spark has some really good resources on guidance on specific funding agencies. I'm just going to show that briefly, but this is a really good resource in case you're curious about very specific agencies. So they have publication sharing policies, and then they also have the data sharing policies split out by agency. So if you're curious about a specific agency, I would highly recommend this website. Private funders also may require some form of data management plans, or they have data management sharing policies. These include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and also the Wellcome Trust. And in addition to funder requirements, many journals are increasingly supporting open data initiatives and asking for data associated with research articles to be shared in some way. Now, the extent of data sharing can range from encouraged to required, depending on the publisher or even different journals within the same publisher. They usually do have policies outlining the requirements. So I would make sure that if you, ahead of time, before you submit, just check the journal requirements around data sharing. You may or may not be familiar with data availability statements, but these are becoming increasingly required by journals. And it's an informational space, generally at the end of a paper, and it details where a user can find the data that's associated with the research article. And if it's not there and not associated, why it might not be, or where the user can get more information. So this is just an example paper. So it has a data availability statement. It has the actual DOI link to the data, and it also has the data referenced in the references. So that is just one example of what you might see when you're looking at articles. So we've talked a lot about data sharing and dissemination, but there are definitely some considerations around data, including whether the data should actually be shared or not. So you may hear the phrase as open as possible and as closed as necessary. This kind of emphasizes the spectrum of openness or closeness that may exist with data sharing. So North Carolina State makes an important point that properly managing data does not necessarily equate to publishing or sharing that data. So there's still the need to recognize some kinds of data may not be shareable, or it will have restrictions to use, such as data with personally identifiable information. But this doesn't mean that we should spend any less time managing the data. We may not be able to just share it as openly as some other kinds of data. Depending on the data that you intend to collect, it may be subject to additional reviews and oversight, including IRB, IACOG, and the Institutional Biosafety Committee, among others, non-exhaustive list. And then existing data can also be used in research, either to build off of or combine with new data to answer new research questions. But in this case, you may want to keep in mind reliability of the data for your purposes, maybe how old it is, who collected it, why they collected it. And there might be access requirements or copyright restrictions that you need to be aware of before you start using this data. Okay, we're going to circle back to data management plans, but I'm going to pause here for just a minute to see if there are any questions that have come up. Okay. So a research data management plan is a document that describes the types of data that will be collected, how that data will be organized, maintained, and documented throughout the project lifecycle, as well as how that data may be shared. And depending on the agency or funder that you work with, there might be varying terms that are used for the plan. NIH is using a data management and sharing plan. NASA is using open science and data management plan. So you may hear varying terms, but they all mean a very similar thing. And just as the terms might vary, what is included might vary slightly as well. But in general, a data management plan should include the data type. So researchers should provide a summary of the data that will be collected or created. This might include noting the content, the type, is it tabular, surveys, audiovisual, what's the format, and the amount of data that is expected. You'll want to outline related tools, software, or code if it's applicable. So are specialized tools and software needed to access or process or analyze the data in any way, and how are these tools able to be obtained? Standard. So a standard specifies how data and the related metadata should be stored, organized, and described. So researchers should note specific data formats, data dictionaries, data identifiers, definitions, any controlled vocabularies that might be pertinent to their field. That would all be in the standard section. In data preservation, access, and associated timelines, researchers should indicate how the data will be shared, when the data will be made available, and who will be able to access the data. And kind of going along with that is the access, distribution, and considerations around reuse. So are there any factors that might affect or limit access or reuse in any way, such as privacy, confidentiality, informed consent, all of that. And then lastly, oversight of data management and sharing. So funders are starting to ask, how is the plan going to be managed and who is responsible for carrying out the plan? And the NIH, at least, has gone a little further in their access section. They want researchers to specify a particular repository or repositories where the data will be stored, how the data will be identified. And they specifically say that the data should be available no later than the time of an associate publication or the end of the performance period, whichever comes first. So I do want to note that this isn't set in stone. So if you create a data management plan, you're like, I'm going to put my data in this specific repository, which is mainly a management system that preserves and makes your data available for future use. If that changes down the line, you are encouraged to update that and provide an updated version of your data management plan. So it's really supposed to be a living document, not just something you create at the beginning. Things are going to change and be updated throughout the project. So funders do realize that. And updates to the data management plans should be made if necessary. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because I'm going to be going more in depth in next week's webinar, but there are several ways to create a data management plan. You can use funder guidance and templates if they're available, or guidance from another funder or agency. There's also the DMP tool, which I'll give a demo of next week as well, which is a walkthrough platform that has guidance specific to a funder. So it outlines what you need to enter and then also provides some guidance about what you may or may not need to add in those sections. So it's a really helpful tool, even just to get started with it. So does anyone have any questions about data management plans? Like I said, I'll be going into a little bit more detail about the actual tools out there next week, but just in general, any questions? Okay, so before we close, I just want to provide a couple resources. There's a lot of data management guidance out there. These are just two samples of resources that might be helpful. ODU resources include IT, so they can help with research computing support, data storage, and guidelines around sensitive and regulated data. The Division of Research and Economic Development provide grant and funding support, compliance support, innovations, commercialization, also the sponsored programs and Office of Undergraduate Research. And ODU does have a policy of training all graduate students in responsible conduct of research, and it does have a data management module. It's been a little while since I've done it, but it goes over a lot of these concepts. So that's also a good place to look and review if you need a refresher. And then ODU libraries are also here for you. So we have subject specialists you can make an appointment with and discuss your research needs. We have research guides. I've also linked the data management guide here. We have librarians that are skilled in other aspects of scholarly communication, citation management, open access, OER, publishing. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you for joining. I know it's a lot to take in. Hopefully it's a little bit clearer about what data management is, why it's important, and what strategies you might use to start thinking through your data management processes.